This is my recreation of Five Nights at Freddy's on a web page, and I don't mean just creating the game in another engine and then exporting it for browsers. I mean everything in the game is built on the web page itself. So your browser that's meant to be used for articles or online shopping or social media. Instead, I used it to make a scary bear game, and I did it all from memory. Today, I'm going to show you how I did this. But in case you're not familiar with how web pages typically work, I'll be using three things in this project. I'll use HTML, which is where you can create elements on the page, and it uses these opening and closing tags to define the elements. I'll use CSS to position these elements, which is basically a list of rules within curly brackets. And I'll use JavaScript to code the game and control all of these elements. And before a bunch of smart people start commenting to tell me that I shouldn't do this, you're right. There were many issues that I came across in this video, and things fell apart super quickly. That's because these tools are mainly designed for user interface, and you're not intended to make a game with them. So it's going to be tricky to make Five Nights at Freddy's this way. But that's the point of the video, so let's begin. I started out by adding an image of the office to the web page, and right off the bat, there's a few things we need to fix. First, there's a horizontal scroll bar. Since I don't need any scroll bars in this game, I set the overflow of the body to be hidden. The body is basically all of the visible content on the web page. That causes the image to get cut off on the right, but it can be fixed by setting the position of the image to absolute, since that makes it separate from the body. Another problem is that I was able to highlight and drag the image. I don't want anything to be highlighted or dragged, so I went ahead and fixed any image on the page to be non-interactable. You may have also noticed that there's some empty space in the top left. That can be easily fixed by setting the margin of the body to 0 pixels. Then I made the office fill the screen. It might look like we're ready to begin, but this needs some more setup. If I resize the window, it can reveal or hide more of the office. So I created my own game window, which is where I'm going to put all of the images. I gave it an aspect ratio of 16:9, which is today's standard, and I made it fill the height of the screen. It wasn't really working at first. I would expect the game window to clip anything that goes outside of it. So to fix it, I set its position to relative. That way the images are a part of the game window and get clipped. To make it look pretty, I set the margin of the game window to auto, which centers it on the screen, and I gave the body a black background. There's still just one more problem. If the page isn't wide enough, then the game window goes outside of it. I would expect black bars to appear on the top and bottom. So instead of just defining the height, I gave it a max width and a max height of the page size. And I centered it vertically by aligning the top border to the middle and then moving it up by half the height. Now, no matter the size of your screen, you can see the full view of the game within a 16:9 aspect ratio. Anyways, I went ahead and fixed my cursed HTML. I don't do this often, okay? I was kinda surprised it let me get away with this. So now that we've got a clean setup, it's time to start making the game for real. I added image elements for the left and right panels, and then used CSS to position them. And it's important that I use percentages only, so that it will scale with the game window. I'm not able to see the right panel since it's off screen, so let's go ahead and add the ability to look left and right with the mouse. In order to do that, we need to know the mouse position. For this, I'll use JavaScript to add an event listener for the mouse moving, and then print the coordinates to the console just to see what I've got. Right now, it's detecting the mouse outside of the game window, but I think it'll be easier if the top left corner of the game window is positioned 00, and if the bottom right corner is positioned 11. So to do that, I gotta get the bounding box of the game window and then do some math with it. We don't have to know how the math works, but just know that it gives us precisely what we want, down to the gazillionth place. And it doesn't matter how I resize the screen. Now in order for the camera to move, the elements must be changing position every frame. So for that, I used a built-in function called requestAnimationFrame, which you can use to call a function every frame. Next, I made a range for the mouse to move the camera. If the mouse is within the range, then it will change the camera position. We can alter the left property in CSS to set the horizontal position of the elements. So I made it update this property every frame for each element based on the camera position. Now we can look left and right, but with this power comes the void. I must fix this by adding a limit to the camera position. Now my next mission was to make the door and light buttons work. So I added some buttons and positioned them over the images of the panel. To make them detect my click, I just added some event listeners in JavaScript to handle it. For now, it just prints to the console to show that it works. I tried to make the buttons invisible, but doing that also made them unclickable, and it revealed another problem. If I double click, then it highlights the office. I also found out that by pressing Ctrl A, it will highlight everything. So to fix this, I just set the property user_select to none. Now that that's fixed, let's get back to work on the buttons. To make them invisible, I just had to set their opacity to 0. Now let's make them actually do something other than print to the console. I added some variables to keep track of the buttons being pressed, and when they're clicked, it will toggle these variables, and then it will change the image of the panel so we can see which buttons are activated. Now we can toggle them on and off instead of just clicking once. Now real quick, I noticed a little problem. If I press tab and then enter, it lets me control the buttons with my keyboard. To prevent this, I set the tab index of each button to -1. So now I can't tab onto the buttons, but still, if I click them and then press enter, it'll start toggling the button again. To fix this, I had to make it prevent the default behavior when clicking. Now that that problem's fixed, let's make the buttons actually do something. The light button is easy, it's just gotta change the frame of the office while it's on. But the door button is going to need a new element, so I created the image of the right door and positioned it over where the door should go. But the question is, how am I going to animate it? The door has 16 frames of animation, and there's no built-in frame editor like game engines have. So what I did was make a variable to keep track of the animation frame. While the door is closed, the variable will go up by 1 every frame with a maximum of 16. And while the door is opened, it will go down by 1 every frame with a minimum of 1. And then it will use the animation variable to set the image by changing the source every frame, which you definitely shouldn't do, but I am. Now the door does animate, but it looks a bit too fast. So what I did was make the animation variable increment by a fraction, and it will ignore the decimal part when setting the image. That gives me more precise control over the speed. One more thing it needs is a cooldown for the door, so that I can't just toggle it while the door is moving. For this, I simply made a variable to keep track of the cooldown, and when you press the button, it'll give you 35 frames until you can click it again. I think the controls for the right side are done now, so I copied everything over to the left side, with new elements for the left button detection and the left door. Now we have working controls on the left, and the only thing we need to fix now is to prevent both lights being enabled at once. So all I did was make it disable the opposite light when you click on a light button. Now the door and light controls are complete. Next is the camera system. I added an image of the indicator that doesn't follow the office camera, along with an image for the monitor animation. And then I got to work making a system to keep track of if the camera is up or down and showing the monitor flipping animation. And here's what I got. The number on the right is keeping track of the camera state. If it's 0, that means it's down. 1 means the monitor is opening, 2 means the camera is open, and -1 means the monitor is closing. This works by setting the camera state to 1 or -1 when your mouse is near the camera arrow, and that triggers the monitor to play its animation similar to how the doors did it. Only this time, it will set the camera state when it's done animating. Also, when the monitor is lowered, its height will be set to 0%, so it will be invisible. That's how I'm going to be making stuff invisible in this video, by setting the height to 0. Now there is a problem with this, which is that if I keep the mouse on the arrow, then the monitor will constantly be smashing our face. To fix this, I'm not going to use a timed cooldown, but instead it will disable the cooldown once the mouse is away from the arrow and the camera is fully opened or closed. Now you essentially have to move the mouse away from the arrow in order to use it again. Next, I imported all of the images needed for the camera interface, and then I built the layout using CSS. I added the static on top of it with a lowered opacity so it's transparent, and I animated it by increasing its animation counter every frame. But just so the bitrate of the video looks good, I made it hidden for now. I then tried to make the camera buttons using CSS styling, but I was having trouble getting the white border of the button to scale properly when resizing the window. So instead, I just used textures of the camera button from the game and set them as a background image for the button, and I made it so when the button is pressed, then it switches to the green image. I then tried to add the text to the button using a custom font and everything, but once again, I just couldn't get it to scale properly. So instead, I took images of the text from the game and just placed it inside the button. So with our button looking good, I went ahead and made the 10 other buttons and positioned them properly. Now that that's out of the way, I need to make it so only one button at a time is always pressed. So I removed the CSS styling to change the background image, and instead I used JavaScript to store every camera button into a list, and then loop through that list to add an event listener for each button, so when they're clicked, it sets the background image to green. Now I can click them to bring color into the world, but we're not done. Next, I made a variable to keep track of the current camera, and it will get set to the ID of the button pressed. Then, it will loop through all of the camera buttons, and it will set them to gray unless it's the one we just pressed. Now, not only can we visually see the button selected, but we've also got a variable that tells us the current camera. With this, I can use a switch statement to look at the current camera and set the image of the camera element. But there's a problem with the kitchen camera. Since there's no image for the kitchen, it will just stay on the previous camera we had selected. So I made a variable to hide the camera that gets set to true when we're looking at the kitchen. And if it's true, then the brightness of the camera gets set to 0. Otherwise, it gets set to 100. And I'll be using this for blackouts later on. Now selecting the kitchen makes everything go black. Although I don't think 100 was the right number. It's supposed to be 1. Now let's make the animatronics able to appear in different cameras. I created a variable for each character to keep track of their position, and then I used a giant switch statement along with a bunch of if-else statements to set the camera image based on who's there. And for the sake of simplicity, I didn't bother with any Easter eggs or multiple positions of Bonnie and Chica in the same camera. I know, it's super lame, but it would probably make the video take an extra week to come out. Okay, now that that's done, all I have to do is set the room I want them to be in, and they'll appear there in the cameras. I tested every room and every combination to verify that it all worked. Foxy is a little different since he moves on one camera, so I used a number to keep track of his position. He also has an animation for running down the hall, but I'll deal with that later. Now I want to finish up the special effects for the camera, starting with the camera scrolling left and right. I made a variable for the camera scroll and one for the scroll speed. The camera scroll will change by the speed every frame, and the camera's horizontal position will be set to the camera scroll. But if it reaches the left or right boundary, then it will reverse the speed. Now we could stop there, but I'd like it to pause at each side like it does in the real game. So first, I made it go past the boundaries a little. And then I clamped the position using a CSS property. Now it looks like the camera stops for a bit once it reaches the left or right. And just like that, the camera is now scrolling. Now the closet does have a lot of darkness, and I'm pretty sure it doesn't scroll, so I made sure to disable scrolling for the closet camera. Next, I got to work adding the white flash effect when switching cameras. It's actually a series of images that play in an animation, so I just gotta set the animation frame to 1 to start the animation, and then it will make the flash visible and start increasing its frames. Once it reaches a certain point, then it will reset everything. Now you get flashbanged every time you switch cameras. I then made this red dot in the corner blink. I did this by making the counter go up by 1 every frame, and it loops back once it reaches 100, but if it's halfway there, then the dot will be hidden. I then made the camera disabled text in the kitchen by adding an image for the text and making it only visible when the kitchen camera is selected. Next, I added the text above the camera that tells you the room you're looking at, and I included it in the giant switch statement to set its image based on the current camera, because I'm just too lazy to change the file name so I can use one line of code instead. And at this point, I've decided that the camera map is too big, but it's already made up of 13 different elements. So is it too late? Well, no, I just need to wrap the camera map and all of the buttons into a div element. And then I can simply change the scale of that div element to resize the whole thing. Anyways, I added the static back, and it looks like the camera interface is pretty much complete. Now I just need to make it able to be opened and closed. Inspired by the trick I just did, I wrapped everything on the camera interface into a div element. I made its height get set to 100% when the camera is opened, and 0 when the camera is closing. Now I can pull up the camera and close it whenever I feel like it, but there are some things that need to be adjusted. First, I made the camera arrow visible on the interface, and I made it hidden when it's on cooldown. Then, I made the white flash animation play when opening the camera. I made the show stage camera button highlighted by default. I made it disable the door lights once the camera is opened. And I made it so you can't look left and right in the office while looking at the cameras. Okay, we're almost ready to start making the AI for the animatronics. But first, they must be able to be seen at the doors. And that's just as simple as using an if-else statement. Now I can set their position to the door, and they'll appear once I turn on the light. Now let's start making their AI. First, I'll need a way to generate random numbers, since their movement should be unpredictable. JavaScript has a random function, but it can only choose a decimal number between 0 and 1. That's cool and all, but it would be easier if I could pick a random integer in a certain range. So I found some code online that does exactly that, and I pasted it into my project. And now, with the power of RNG, we can make the animatronics move. Let's start with Bonnie, since he's the easiest. I want him to have a chance to move every 5 seconds, so on 60 FPS, that would be 300 frames. Once that timer expires, there will be a 1 in 4 chance for him to move. Making him move is very simple. It just looks at his current position and then sets it to something else. So for example, if he's on the show stage, then there's a 1 in 2 chance for him to move to either the backstage or the dining area. And I just gotta do that for every location he can move to. I waited for a while and he eventually moved off the stage. But just to make it easier to test, I made it a 100% chance for him to move. And I watched as he made his way to the office and he eventually reached the left door. So now what? Well, once he's at the door, it's not random where he moves anymore. If you've got the door closed, he goes back to the dining area. Otherwise, he goes into your office. Now the door actually serves a purpose instead of being a cool little button. Now there is an issue you may have noticed. In the real game, you can't see the animatronics as they're moving, but here, you can see Bonnie teleport. To fix it, I made a blackout timer that turns the camera dark, and it will do a blackout for 180 frames if you're looking at Bonnie before or after he moves. Now it gives the effect that Bonnie walked in or out right when the camera glitched. However, you can still see him teleport to the door. To make it less noticeable, I made it a 90% chance for the light to stay on every frame. This makes the lights blink and also creates a terrifying atmosphere. Now once he gets into the office, he just disappears from existence. That's technically supposed to happen, but what the real game does is disable the left panel so you don't notice that he's gone. So Bonnie will turn off the light once he moves, and then the buttons won't be able to do anything once he's in the office. Now when he enters, the light goes off on its own, and I'm unable to turn it back on or close the door. I'll make his jump scare later. Making Chica was a lot easier since it was just copying and pasting Bonnie's code and changing the word Bonnie to Chica. And, of course, changing the movement path. I watched Chica run around the building and refuse to go to the door, which is something she loves doing on this channel. but she did eventually make it to the door, and it works the same way it does for Bonnie, just on the right side this time. I did notice an issue where the screen would flash whenever she moved in or out of the kitchen camera, so I disabled that for the kitchen. Next, I made Freddy. I gave him a movement opportunity every 3 seconds, but he's unable to move if the camera is up or if anyone is on the stage. He will always take the same path to the office, and he can't move back, so the only way to stop him is to slow him down with the camera. He also doesn't appear at the door. Freddy will go straight from the corner of the hall into the office if you don't have the door closed. I also don't need to give him code for the camera blackout, since you can never see him move. Freddy is by far the most intimidating animatronic in this game, and I kinda wish he stayed like that throughout the series. But he's been rehabilitated. Real quick, I fixed some stuff with the camera blackouts, and then I started making Foxy. He's got a movement opportunity every 5 seconds just like Bonnie and Chica, but he has an additional stun timer that prevents him from moving, and the way you stun him is by opening the camera. So we've got another animatronic that can't move while the camera is opened, but even 3 seconds after it's closed. Now when he moves, it simply increases his progress level. Once he reaches progress 3, he's supposed to be in the hallway. Now it's time to make his running animation. I made a variable called Foxy Run, and once it gets set to 1, then it will start increasing every frame to play an animation on the camera sprite. Now for some reason, the file names for the animation have an underscore once it reaches 22. I'm still too lazy to change the file names, so I just added an if-else statement to take care of that. To test it, I made it play the animation once the West Hall was clicked, but when I went to see it, it looked like Foxy teleported. I guess it was still loading the images, since when I reloaded the page, it didn't skip any frames. That's a scary problem that I'll need to address later. Anyways, I adjusted the speed by switching the counter to use decimals. And that's his running animation complete. Now obviously, once the animation ends, he's supposed to arrive at the door, but it's not going to be the exact frame the animation ends. So instead of limiting his animation counter, I let it continue counting to act as a timer for when he arrives at the door. Once that timer is up, it will reset his running counter and he'll go back to the cove if the door is closed. Now you can react to Foxy within a reasonable amount of time. But something's missing. If I don't close the door on him, then I would expect him to peek through the door and scare me. Since all of the animatronics are done, I think I'll actually go ahead and add all of the jumpscare animations. So I added a new image element and made it scroll with the office. Then I made some variables to control the jumpscare image and animate it. If this jump anim variable is empty, then everything will be normal. But if I change it to Bonnie, then Bonnie appears screaming in our face. I also made it so that in jumpscare mode, it disables the camera indoors. That way you're not clicking stuff while the animation plays. Now to trigger Bonnie's jumpscare in-game, he will wait for you to lift down the camera while he's in the office. I'm not going to be making a game over screen for this project, so after a timer finishes, it will just set the static to the front layer and make it fully opaque. With that, I set Bonnie's position to the office, and after flipping the camera, he jumps out for a second, and then the screen turns to static. Now I gotta reload the page to try again. One more thing I added to prevent cheese is make it force the camera down if you've been looking at it for a long time while Bonnie is in the office, which in turn will trigger his jump scare. I noticed a weird thing where the static kept flickering, so I disabled the animation after the jump scare and that seemed to fix it. Now it's time to add the jump scare for everybody. Making Chica's was easy since she basically works the same as Bonnie, so once again, it was really just copying and pasting Bonnie's code and changing the word Bonnie to Chica. For Foxy, if he's finished running and the door isn't closed, it will trigger his jump scare and force the cameras down if they're opened. Now he can check on me to see if I'm okay, but I die from a heart attack. Also, something I forgot to add earlier for Foxy is an anti-cheese timer, so after 900 frames of him waiting for me in the hallway, he just sneaks up to the door. And another thing I forgot to do was make his running only get triggered when he's inside the hall, so I was wondering why Foxy kept spamming my door. Anyways, I finished with Freddy's jump scare. So every second that he's in the office, there will be a 1 in 4 chance for his jump scare to trigger as long as the cameras are down. So when he's in the office, you could just be minding your own business and then suddenly bam, there he is. Well, now there's a way to die, but what about a way to win? You win by lasting 6 in-game hours, so I added some images on the screen to show the time, and I made a minute counter that goes up every second, and once it reaches 60, then the in-game hour increases and it switches the number on the counter. Just to test, I made each hour last a second, and as you can see, the clock is working. That is, until it reaches unknown image o'clock. It's supposed to take you to a cutscene once it hits 6 AM, but I don't feel like doing all that. So I just made it tell you you won, and then reload the game. Who needs a 6 AM screen anyways? So now that we've got an obstacle and a goal, the game should be complete, right? Well, not really. There's nothing stopping us from just closing the doors and waiting until the end of the night. So there needs to be one more mechanic put in place, which is the power system. While I was making the UI for this, or user interface, I got jump scared by Foxy.
That was so scary. Oh my.
But I eventually finished the UI, and just like the time, I used images instead of text to change the counter, cause remember, I couldn't get the text to scale properly. I first made the usage meter since that controls the power, so if you click one of the door buttons for example, it will increase by 1 if you closed it, or decrease by 1 if you opened it. Which, by the way, I think it makes more sense for the door being open to take more power, but whatever. I also made the usage increase by opening the camera, and the bar will simply set its image based on the usage amount. Now you can notice the bar in the bottom left increase as I use more systems. I noticed a bug where it would just keep increasing without going down if I clicked the opposite door light while the other was on. I fixed it by making it keep the usage the same if the opposite light is on. But I also had to make sure the usage decreases for anything else that disables the light without you clicking it, like when opening the camera or when Bonnie or Chica enter the room. Now there shouldn't be any problems with the usage forever increasing. Now time to make the actual power. The power gets set to 999 at the start of the night, and I chose to make it decrease every second by the usage times 1.2. And that's it. To show the number on the screen though, I'll have to take the actual power, divide it by 10, and round it down. Then the first digit on the screen will set its image to the first digit of that number, and the second one will use the last digit. Now you can see the power decrease in game, and it decreases faster the more systems you use at once. But it starts bugging out under 10%. I just gotta make sure to hide the first digit on the screen once the number becomes 1 digit long. While testing this out, I got jump scared by Foxy again.
Foxy, you're so scary! Ah!
Anyways, once the power reaches 0, that's when a power out should occur. That means it will disable the lights, the doors, and the camera. It will automatically turn off the lights and open the doors, and close the camera if it's open. It will disable Foxy and Freddy's jump scare from triggering, and it will set the office bright to a render with the lights off. It also hides the panel buttons and all of the UI, so I use that div element trick to easily hide all of the UI at once. And after a few failed attempts, another Foxy jump scare, and fixing a few things, I eventually got this power out to work. Now all that's left is to have Freddy appear and play his little song. Every frame that the power is out, a counter will be increasing by 1. Once this counter reaches 600, there will be a 1 in 2 chance every frame for the office to switch to an image with Freddy's face, and that makes it look like he appears flickering at the doorway. Once the counter reaches 1200, then there's a 1 in 2 chance every frame for the office to disappear, and 20 frames after, the office disappears for good. This gives the effect that the lights flicker off once Freddy's done singing. And finally, once the counter reaches 1800, then Freddy will jump scare the player using his own Freddy jump scare element, which is just an image that covers the whole screen. So the power out sequence does have a fixed timer in this version, but I really didn't feel like doing all of that randomization stuff. Anyways, the game is fully playable now, All that's missing is, well, all of the sounds. I've never actually added sounds to a web page before, but it's pretty simple. All you gotta do is define the sound by creating an audio object, and then you can just play it. But notice how sometimes the audio doesn't play when I click it. That's because the audio can't interrupt itself, so I'll have to set its playback time to 0 before playing it. For looping sounds, like the ambience, just set loop to true and then play it. And you can adjust the volume by setting the volume property to a number between 0 and 1. I can use a trick with the volume to make the sound for the door lights. Their sound is always playing, but the volume is set to 0 while the lights are off. And then I got jump scared by Foxy again.
That was so scary. That was so scary. That was so scary. That was so scary.
But I'm glad he did, because when I reloaded the page, the ambience stopped playing. And I discovered that apparently, you have to interact with the web page before any sounds can play. So I made a start game function that not only starts the ambient sounds, but it starts the frames and mouse position detection. With this, everything is disabled and the start game function must be called before anything can happen. So I made a click to start image that covers the whole screen, and once the user clicks, it will call the start game function and hide the click to start image. And now when I reload the page, everything is quiet at first until I click. Anyways, I did some work off camera, and now all of the sounds are done. Okay, I would have liked to go into more detail with some of these, but this video is becoming way too long. I only included the most important sounds, and I didn't add any randomization. So for example, Freddy always does the same laugh. At this point, I completely gave up writing comments or trying the bare minimum to organize or optimize the code. I really shouldn't have wrote the whole game in one giant script, but it's still good enough though, at least for me, and I actually took the time to give the game a serious play. I was terrified that I might get jump scared for no reason, but thankfully that didn't happen, and I managed to beat it on my first try. Although the power was quite lenient, so I adjusted it afterwards. So now that the game is done, there's just a few things left to do, and that would be optimizations and user experience, because I decided to do the fun part first and everything else later. So, let's address that problem we saw earlier with the animations being all choppy. What's causing this issue? Well, it's complicated. If I look at the network tab on the developer tools, you can see an entry appear for every frame of the animation as it plays. That must mean it's having to load something on every frame of the animation. So my natural instinct was to preload the animations into memory. And one way to do that is by creating an image object in JavaScript, since that forces the page to load it into memory without drawing it on the screen. I created a loop to make it load each frame of each animation. And trust me, it wasn't easy. Especially since I still refuse to change the file names of Foxy's running animation. And in order to keep it all loaded into memory for good, you can simply store the preloaded images into a list. Now when I test the game, it doesn't spam a bunch of new entries for the frames whenever an animation plays. There still might be some things that cause choppiness, but this is a good sign. The only problem is that I couldn't really find a way to test how good it worked, since the images are stored somewhere into a cache deep within my system, and the animations were only choppy the first time I viewed them. But, if it means anything, it's now possible to keep the static animated after a game over without it flickering. So I know it did something. Alright, there's one more big problem I gotta fix. If I change the frame rate of my device to something like 120 frames per second for example, then everything in the game runs at 2 times speed. And not just the animations, but also the animatronics, the time, power, and everything except the sounds. This happens because we're calling the request animation frame method every frame. So by doubling the frame rate, This method gets called double the amount of times every second. But this method comes with a parameter that gives us the current time in milliseconds. We can use this to calculate the amount of time passing between each frame, also known as the delta time. We can see that on 60 frames per second, it takes about 0.016 seconds between each frame. But if I switch to 120 frames per second, then it takes about half that time. So now I gotta adjust anything that counts up or down every frame by multiplying the hard-coded value by 60, since that's my target frame rate, and then multiplying that by delta time. And after doing that for the whole code, I was surprised to see it work first try. So by switching to another frame rate, the game still runs just as fast. I was so happy that I said hooray.
Hooray!
Finally, I added a prompt to reload the page after getting jump scared, and we're done. Alright friends, that's it for this video. I was going to say some important stuff in the outro, but I know 90% of people don't watch this far, so I'll just say it in a pinned comment instead. Feel free to join the Discord server linked below for technical FNAF discussions and help. My DMs are always open to anyone that needs help or has a question. But that's all for now.